All right, so now that we have covered some universal parenting goals and three general dimensions of parenting practices, we're going to dive into specific parenting styles now. And specifically, we're going to look at Baumrind's framework from the 1970s. So this is a very famous framework of parenting styles where Baumrind conducted interviews and observations on preschoolers and their parents. And Baumrind found primary patterns of parenting behaviors. And we see those patterns or styles listed here, these four in yellow. So we have the authoritative style, authoritarian style, permissive style, and uninvolved or neglectful style. So we'll go over all these in detail in the next slides. But first, let's look at this little chart here. I know it might be kind of small on your end, but this is encompassing those three dimensions we talked about: emotional warmth, autonomy support, and behavioral control. And you can see how these four styles fit into these dimensions. So for neglectful or uninvolved, there's a lot of autonomy support, but not so much emotional warmth or behavioral control. For authoritarian parents, very high behavioral control and not a lot of emotional warmth or autonomy support. We have permissive wedged in between here. It encompasses a degree of autonomy support and emotional warmth. However, it does lack behavioral control. And in the middle here, authoritative seems to encompass all three of these dimensions. So as a little recap or a little preview before we get into these in more detail. So our first stop is the authoritative parenting style. So these parents set high standards for their child's behavior, but at the same time recognize that children have their own needs and rights. And they respect those needs and rights. But so they tend to be warm and responsive, and they do attempt to control their child though, and they do so through reasoning with them instead of something like physical punishment that we might see in the next style. So they attempt to reason with the child, but they are also warm and responsive. So you could see there is a level of attempting to control and guide the child, but using reasoning. And they do have that element of warmth and responsiveness. So research has found in potential child outcomes here, they're more likely to be self-reliant, they're more content, and more willing to explore and accept social rules. Just some of the research findings out there for the authoritative style. Now, the authoritarian style, this is much different than the last one. So it is attempting to control and evaluate their child's behavior according to set traditional standards. So they are less warm and responsive. They stress obedience and authority, and they favor punitive measures over reasoning with the child. So we can think of it as more of a power dynamic here in the parent. Whereas authoritarian, the last one, the parents are trying to level with the child, trying to be kind of on equal terms. In this authoritarian style, the parent makes it very clear that they are the authority figure and the child needs to follow what they say. So it's a very different dynamic. So research has found children of authoritarian parents are more likely to become easily frustrated, more likely to withdraw from social contact and look to authority for guidance, and less likely to take initiative or be responsive. So you might be wondering you might be noticing that authoritarian and authoritative sound very similar. How are we going to tell the difference between these two styles? How are we going to remember the difference since they both start with the first same 6 letters or so, and then the last bit is different barely. So one trick for me when I was learning all this stuff in school is I thought of authoritative as being synonymous with facilitative, because going back to authoritative, they're kind of facilitating with their child as they guide them, right? They're talking and leveling with the child, they're facilitating with the child. So as opposed to authoritarian, they're kind of dominating over the child. So that was one little trick that I used to remember the difference. I equate authoritative with the word facilitative. They both have the same ending, right? Tative. So maybe that'll trick will help you, maybe it won't. I just wanted to share it with you because I know that they do sound very similar, but as you can see, they are very different styles despite having very similar names. So those are the first two parenting styles. And I do have anyone who watches that 70s show, I have Red and Eric here. Red Foreman is prime example of an authoritarian parent. He's very much what I say goes, very dominating. I'm the parent, you're the child. And that's kind of the dynamic we often see in authoritarian parenting. On the other end, permissive parenting. I have another pop culture mom here from Mean Girls, Amy Poehler's character would be a very dramatic example of a permissive parent. But let's go over what these kind of parents, what their practices are. So they tend to exercise less control over the child's behavior than the other two styles. Just as the name suggests, they're a bit permissive in what they allow the child to do or not do. So they believe children have to learn how to behave through their own experience. So it's kind of one of the underlying principles here, to learn through their own experience. There's not a lot of control on the parent's end. They tend to be emotionally warm, and they do not demand the same levels of achievement or standards of their behavior from their child as the last two styles. So authoritarian and authoritative did have a level of demand for the levels of achievement and standards, but they were different in how they guided their child in that way. Permissive parenting, it's kind of lacking that element of they're not very demanding in general. So obedience isn't really emphasized here. Now, research has shown that possible child outcomes of permissive parenting, they're more likely to be dependent on others, more likely to exhibit poor impulse control, and to struggle accepting responsibility for their actions. Just some general findings out there. So that, like I said, if you've seen Mean Girls, you know exactly what this character is like. As it says here, I'm not a regular mom, I'm a cool mom. Again, this is a very dramatic example, but it would fall under permissive parenting. Lastly, we have uninvolved parenting. So uninvolved parenting style, they're making few demands and providing little supervision. Kind of like permissive. So we have some similarities there, but the difference here is there is not the element of emotional warmth. So there's little effort to acknowledge the children's emotions and perspectives. And it could be due to something like parental depression, right? Or maybe extreme overwhelm or stress with life factors. Maybe there's financial stress. There could be a number of reasons why this style might be occurring, where there's really a lack of warmth and a lack of demands toward the child. As it implies, it's very uninvolved in general. So that is this parenting style. And as it says here, it can disrupt virtually all aspects of a child's development. So as always, we're not aiming to villainize any parents. A lot of factors can explain these parenting practices that we went over, and especially this one. It could be economic factors, mental health factors. Maybe they're repeating the way that they were parented. We'll see that oftentimes, repeating cycles. There's a number of factors that could explain the parenting styles we just talked about. So other things to consider here is that Baumrind's original study that led to these parenting categories we talked about, they included predominantly white middle-class families. This poses the question, just how representative is this framework of all families? Because obviously all families are not white and middle class. So that poses this big question. Some cross-cultural studies have revealed, for example, a no-nonsense or tough love parenting style that is not included in Baumrind's framework. So in this style, there is high parental control, including physical restraint and punishment, and warmth and affection. Doesn't really fit into any of the styles we talked about. So high parental control with physical punishment kind of sounds like authoritarian, but it includes warmth and affection, which is not included in the authoritarian style. So what happens with, this kind of parenting style that is not included in Baumrind's framework? There needs to be more research on these things. And this type of parenting style, is tough love, no nonsense, is practiced by many African American and Mexican American parents. So it doesn't really fall into any of the categories described by Baumrind. So that poses the question, what are the implications of this parenting style? This is just one example, just saying that we need to be mindful of these major frameworks and consider how they might not accurately explain the experience of all children. Another thing to consider is that not all parents use the same parenting styles, parenting practices, right? What I mean is if you're in a two-parent household, what if one parent exhibits one parenting style and the other parent exhibits a whole different parenting style? This was my experience growing up. My mom was very authoritative, a little bit seeping into authoritarian, but mostly authoritative. My dad was hardcore permissive parent all the way. So the very different styles. So it makes you wonder, it makes you question this, right? Like, what are the implications here? If a child is kind of being pulled in two different directions by two very different styles by their parents, how will this change the potential impact on the child? Because realistically, they're not always going to be isolated with one parenting style in the household. There's going to be multiple. So that's another thing to consider here. So just some other considerations to make sure we're well-rounded in our discussion here, that all those things we went over are not black and white, just making sure we understand that. So the last part of the day is let's test ourselves a little on what we just went over. So parenting style puzzle. So based on what we went over, which one would be a parent? What would the name of the parenting style be for a parent who is demanding and accepting and responsive? Think about it for a second. If you thought to yourself authoritative, you would be correct. Now, what about a parent who is demanding and rejecting or unresponsive? Think about it for a second. All the styles we went over. This would be authoritarian. So they have the demanding element, but they're also lack that emotional warmth, right? Now, what about they're undemanding and uncontrolling, but they are accepting and responsive? This would be permissive parents. And then undemanding, uncontrolling, and rejecting and unresponsive, that only leaves one more, the uninvolved parent. So this would have been more effective in a live class, but thank you for following along anyway. So that covers everything that we were going to talk about in terms of the parenting style. So we talked all about Baumrind's framework of those different styles, but just make sure you are keeping an open mind that it isn't always black and white, as all the things we presented. There can be a lot of other considerations like we just covered in the last slide. So that finishes up parenting styles, that we have a few more stops of the day, so don't go away yet. So thanks for joining everyone, and I will see you in the next video.